academic excellence. They viewed that the one wing of the church, influenced by the Congregationalists, was not as fundamental, not as doctrinally strict as they should be. So they engineered, through the offices of Charles Hodge, who was the preeminent theologian of the 19th century, engineered a split. In fact, they disinvited about a third of their churches, who broke off and became the so-called New School, the more liberal wing, which is more likely to espouse anti-slavery positions from the pulpit. One of the key elements of the old school church, aside from the strict doctrine, was an adherence to the U.S. Constitution as a gift from God, a blessing to the country, which assured the prosperity not only of the country, but of our spiritual development. So one, commitment to the Constitution as it existed, and secondly, an agreement that we should not discuss politics from the pulpit. Now, by politics, that was a code word. Politics were essentially okay, but what you didn't want to talk about was slavery, because that was the most divisive political issue of the era. So when you went to an old school Presbyterian church, you can be assured of three things. Strict doctrine, according to the Westminster Confession of Faith, as defined by Charles Hodge, essentially. And you can be assured that there would be a commitment to the government as it exists, and you would never hear a word about slavery preached from the pulpit. So, moving on, Gurley goes to seminary at Princeton, does his 4 years there, develops this wonderful reputation as not only a committed Christian and an educator and a scholar, but a hail fellow well met. This guy must have had an extraordinary personality, because people are complimenting him on being a pleasure to be with. He was obviously an entertainer. He could sing, he could play the flute. He was just a pleasure to be with. So people would talk about him as being among our best men, not only academically, but socially. One writer says, if all Christians were like Gurley, I'd be one in a minute. So he graduates in 1840, and his other mentor, aside from Charles Hodge, his other mentor was Archibald Alexander. Archibald Alexander had been the preeminent preacher in the United States. His preaching style was so excellent, so well structured, and so well modulated and thoughtful that his reputation was of being the best at that art in the country. Well, he's the one who taught Gurley to use his voice in a way which gave power and meaning to his preaching. Gave the interpretation of the Bible almost magical quality, which captivated audiences. So we're talking about a very skilled and gifted person from the pulpit, who now is completely well-grounded in conservative theology because of his relationship with Charles Hodge. Alexander would die in 1850, and so that would left a void in his continuing mentorship. But Hodge would continue his relationship with Gurley up until near the time of his death. They will part ways, but that's another part of the story. Gurley, looking for his first job, again, remember that this is the schism in the church, that the new school and the old school had broken apart. So 2 years after that occurred, Gurley graduates. He could have gone anywhere in the country, because the quote we have from Alexander, his mentor, was that he was good enough for any place. But where did he go? I could almost hear the conversation. Son, we've got trouble in the West. We've been dominated by the Congregationalists out there. The frontier is growing like crazy. The old school is not as well represented as we need to be there. We need you to go. He gets the offer from the First Presbyterian Church of Indianapolis. Alexander says, well, I got the guy for you. He went out and was an immediate success. Right out of the seminary, this guy was already becoming confidant of the major politicians, the governor, the senators of the state. He is invited to give the opening speeches for the new Capitol building, which has just opened in Indianapolis, which only 3 years earlier had been named the state capitol. So he's coming into a brand new capital development situation and essentially taking charge. There was another pastor in town who has taken over the new school Presbyterian church, and that is Henry Ward Beecher. So these two become friends in that Indianapolis town. But their contrasting styles of preaching was captured by a traveler, a woman who kept a diary, that attended both churches on one Sunday, which was not uncommon up through the late 19th century. People would go to church in the morning and in the evening. There'd be two services. So she went in the morning to the second church, the new school, and in the afternoon she heard Gurley at the first church. And she wrote in her diary the contrast, that Gurley's words went to the heart, like the still small voice that you heard from God. And you took his simple message away and kept it. Whereas Henry Ward Beecher, who acknowledges that he had trouble finding his voice early in his ministry, was like the thunderclap that quickly faded away. And so I find it interesting that Beecher would go on to develop essentially a style like that, but obviously in a more welcoming tone, since he became so popular as the Billy Graham of his era. Whereas Gurley was always the pastor's pastor, always focused on the church in front of him and that population. 10 years in Indianapolis. He has been the presiding pastor at several major state events. The commemorations for the territorial governor, William Henry Harrison, and for the Andrew Jackson Memorial, which was a big deal throughout the state. He gave the invocation, the benediction, bracketed the main speaker for the event. So he was well known in the state. He became a member of the board of the first college for the deaf and dumb, set up in Indiana. He was the founding board member. He encouraged the governor to invite to that board some other pastors, Henry Ward Beecher and Matthew Simpson. Matthew Simpson would go on to become the head of the Methodist Church at the time of the Civil War. So all this talent was collected in Indianapolis in the 1840s. And Gurley began then to his role of being a convener, a conciliator, bringing people together for all sorts of functions around religion and community. 4 of his 5 children were born in Indianapolis during those 10 years. 1849, he gets a call from Dayton, Ohio, First Church of Dayton. He is becoming concerned that the rough and tough tumble of the capital of the state may not be the best place to raise his children. So he moves to Dayton, Ohio, a much more family-friendly environment. He is there for 4 years, almost 4 years. And what's happening here in D.C. has captured the attention of the Presbyterian General Assemblies. For 3 or 4 years prior to the time we're going to talk about, so the late 1840s, early 1850s, the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church is very concerned that we are not well represented in the nation's capital. Now, you say, we are all friends of Dr. James Lowry, who was the pastor of the F Street Presbyterian Church, which was the principal old school church in this community. Remember, Lowry died after 50 years of being the pastor. The last 15 years of his life, he was quite enfeebled and sickly. So he was dependent upon supply assistant pastors who would come in and lead much of the services. So Lowry began to fade away, and as a result, there was no energy holding the old school Presbyterians together. In fact, old school Presbyterians who were elected to Congress, who were brought in by administrations, would go off to other churches because they were not happy with the quality of the preaching they found at the F Street Church. So you can just see the General Assembly of 1853, which is usually held in May, wringing their hands over, we're losing the game there in the national capital, the most visible place in the country, and we are not well represented. We need to do everything we can to get our best man to that place to rebuild people's belief in the old school system there in the nation's capital. Now think about that. For those of you who are Presbyterians, you know we don't go placing people. Every congregation is able to call its own pastor. But in this case, they were so concerned, they were even talking about building a national Presbyterian cathedral in D.C. And so that the General Assembly can take the initiative and hire the right person to staff that. End of 1853, Lowry had died. In April 1853, James Lowry was dead. His supply assistant, D.X. Junkin, shortly announced his resignation to go to Lafayette College, which left the pulpit at F Street completely vacant. Instantly, the Presbytery of Baltimore, as it was then, which controlled this district, instantly they thought of Phineas Gurley as being the right successor. There was no doubt about it. He had become the eminent preacher of his time. within the Presbyterian Church. He'd been invited by the other preeminent pastors to go and teach that as a professor of preaching and pastoral theology at places like the Danville Seminary, which Robert J. Breckenridge, important in the old school denomination there, had just founded. And his first thought was to reach out for Gurley to help him beef up that department. During the 1850s, people like Cyrus McCormick, who had funded the industrialists, who had funded a church and seminary in Chicago, he had been in Washington during the 1850s and was very taken with Gurley's preaching. He had, in fact, bought a pew here at the F Street Church. And he insisted on Gurley coming to found his seminary in Chicago, which all these Gurley declined. The opportunity he wanted at one point was to go to Princeton. But that wasn't available in 1853 when everybody went after him to come to here to D.C. There were 4 members of the search committee out of Baltimore who implored him to come and look at this situation in response to the session at F Street Church. They said, "We are so strongly supportive of this Phineas Gurley, we think that you ought to do everything you can to get him immediately." And so, because of that recommendation, there was a meeting of session in which it was voted unanimously. After a little argument, one guy wanted to hold out. "We haven't heard him preach." And they said, "Doesn't matter, his recommendations are so strong, we just want to send the call right now." So they voted unanimously, sent the call. He came, he looked over the situation, saw the state of the Capitol, the city of magnificent intentions back then, with its muddy corridors, muddy streets, no curbs, and occasionally coffles of slaves being driven down the street. The Secretary of State, the Secretary of the Navy, all sorts of highly elected officials here in D.C. wrote to him. So within a month, on Christmas Day, 1853, he's in the pulpit announcing to his congregation that he's changed his mind. It's clear that God wants him to go to D.C. So in 1854, he takes the pulpit at the F Street Church, and that is the church that was on the site of what is now the Business Center at the Willard Hotel on F Street near 14th. That was where the original F Street Church was. So Gurley came to town. It was an immediate hit. Right away, he's presiding over some of the prominent funerals and weddings. His preaching style is an instant success. He starts acquiring large members to attend the F Street Church services, and he sponsors several revival sessions. The 1850s was a period of great revival of Christian belief in this country, and he took advantage of that by staging week-long revival sessions at the church. Now, let's qualify revival. Remember, we're talking about conservative church values here. Revival back then was equated with evangelism, which simply meant you were preaching the word of Christ from the gospel. It did not have to do with the emotional preaching that was common. Gurley was trained at Princeton. The emphasis there was on scholarship, on precision, on clear argument. So he would always write out his sermons and preach from an outline form. He would have them numerated, 1, 2, 3, 4. Here's the case. And the case would unfold before his hearers. So between the style of his delivery and the style of the structure of his sermons, his reputation continued to grow enormously among an educated class of people. So he would come to the attention of President Pierce. Pierce was not a member of the F Street Church. He was a member of the First Presbyterian. But you'll remember that he was the reputation of being a doughface, a northerner with pro-slavery tendencies. So the pro-slavery, the anti-slavery church would have been First Presbyterian. So he would go there to show that he's really a northerner at heart, but then he would console the southern Congress people and essentially set up the stage for Buchanan to kick the can down the road. There was no dealing with the slavery issue during those administrations. So he would come to hear the quality of Gurley's preaching, and he would stop at the pastor's home. There was a personal relationship developed with President Pierce and with and Mr. Gurley. Gurley wrote several sympathetic letters that he thinks that appears as an honorable man who's been abused. So he develops that relationship and maintains the confidentiality of that president. He does the same for James Buchanan. Buchanan takes a pew at the F Street Church. That'll continue to the new church. And then he continues to receive Gurley's counsel. Now, Abraham Lincoln's election, November 1860. The country is in turmoil. Gurley is concerned about the anxiety that is raised here in the Capitol, holds several union meetings to encourage people to focus on keeping the country together. That sets the stage for Lincoln coming to town in February, at the time of the Peace Convention. June 1858, we're back in D.C., and Phineas Gurley is invited to preach on this site at what was then the Second Presbyterian Church. That started a process. He was invited back to discuss unification of the two churches shortly thereafter, and within a year that was agreed upon. Now, the second church had been conflicted. Half of its members were old school, half of its members were new school. They had difficulty attracting members, but they did insist that if we're going to make this transition and unite, we'll let you accept those members who want to go to the new church that survives, but you've got to build it on our site. So that's how the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church came to be built here, from moving from the F Street. Gurley wound up preaching in a brand new church here, which opened in October 1860. It was described as one of the most elegant churches in the East Coast. It had a lot of architectural features that made it easy to hear. Joseph Henry of the Smithsonian Institution was interested in acoustics, and he had input to the design here to make it a more useful auditorium upstairs for Gurley. The church opened 1 month after they had to get out of their old church, the F Street Church. The Willard brothers needed access to that to begin the conversion to an auditorium, so it would be ready for the Washington Peace Conference on February 4, 1861. So for 1 month, we were without a church home entirely. So we had access at that time to a vacant building on 10th Street, the old 10th Street Baptist Church, which in 2 years later, which would be remade into Ford's Theater. So for 1 month, this congregation met in what became Ford's Theater before the new building was occupiable. So, fast forward to February. Pastor Gurley has been invited to address the Washington Peace Conference. He gives the opening prayer and invocation. He's invited back 3 times by President Tyler to speak to that group on his hopes for peace. So he was the most re-invited pastor to speak to that assembly, which included Northerners and Southerners, clearly indicating that his reputation for shooting straight down the middle and not having one side or the other with regard to the slavery issue in his preaching. He certainly was a Union man, and that came through in the speeches at the Peace Conference. Washington becomes the destination for Mr. Lincoln, who shows up here on February 23rd. He meets with several people that day, one of whom is Montgomery Blair, to be his postmaster general. He comes out of that meeting, and it seems he's suddenly struck with the need to find a church. There was no indication leading up to this that this was part of his intention. He had become lax in his church attendance in Springfield again. His old friend, Dr. James Smith, left in 1856. And so for 4 years, he didn't feel any real compulsion to attend church regularly, and his attendance fell off. He scrambled to justify his religious positions at the time of the election and for the campaign. And he had several committees of ministers who put together some really sketchy descriptions of what his faith was, describing him as a regular church attender. He did pay the dues for the pew in Springfield for Mary. She had asked for that, and they maintained that. So he was trying to take credit for all that. But there's no indication, even among the diaries of his closest friends, that that was top of his mind when he was coming to Washington. What was top of mind was the rapidly unfolding secession crisis. South Carolina seceded on December 20, 1860, and 7 states had also seceded by the time he got to Washington. The country was unraveling. He had no tools. He wasn't even the president yet. He wouldn't be until March 6th. He wasn't the president. He had no tools, and yet he had to somehow do what he could to stop this emotion from taking hold in other states. I believe that Montgomery Blair, who was well known in the border states, had great family connections, political connections in Missouri, Kentucky, and Maryland. I believe that the conversation with Lincoln may have gone something like this. Mr. President, I understand that you have from time to time gone to an old school Presbyterian church. I'd like to remind you that one of the strongest political forces we have in Kentucky to stem the secession tide is the old school Presbyterian church under Dr. Robert J. Breckinridge, the uncle of the recently defeated presidential candidate. Breckinridge was the son of the founder of Kentucky, the man who wrote the founding articles to create the state. Very well known, very strongly supported by the old school faction, which was the dominant faction in Kentucky at that time. So my sense is that Montgomery Blair prevailed on the president to make an announcement of his renewed acceptance of an old school connection here in D.C., to send the right signal to Breckinridge and his supporters in Kentucky that this president would remain true to his word and not be caught sitting through a sermon by an abolitionist or a secessionist pastor. Where Breckinridge was a slave holder and they were iffy on the slave question, they certainly were promoting a strong Union position. So that's the twig that I think the president hung his hat on by announcing that he wished to find a pastor in Washington who was aloof from politics. That was the code phrase for the old school Presbyterian pulpit. The first Sunday after his inauguration, Mary Lincoln's sister, Grimsley, wrote about the family attending their first church service at the New York Avenue Church, the brand new church. They would have seen Dr. Gurley preach from this pulpit, which was part of the original church that was built on this site and opened in October of 1860. So, brand new church, brand new situation for the president. He showed up the following week with Winfield Scott and continued to attend regularly, unlike his performance in Springfield. The fall of Fort Sumter on April 14th was a Sunday. The president was in church that morning and heard Gurley preach about, let's take a deep breath here. This is one more chance for the rational minds to try to understand a way for peace out of this. Let's not knee-jerk go to war on this. But at the end of his sermon, he said, now that's our prayer, but whatever happens, we have to bless the decisions of this administration. Lincoln very much appreciated the sentiment and support. He invited the pastor to come pray with him that afternoon. And that would set the precedent for frequent invitations to the White House for prayer. Almost every major battle occasion. Gurley writes about being with the president on the Battle of First Bull Run, the Battle of Second Bull Run. So there is a pattern which is set of counsel and prayer, which established this connection with the Gurleys and the Lincolns. In fact, the pastor felt so comfortable with the president by June 6th of that year, 1861, he invited the president to his daughter's wedding, which was going to be held 3 days hence. I cannot find any evidence that the president helped to arrange the leave for the young soldier, William A. Elderkin. He was a new West Point graduate. He had been moved from D.C. across the river with the invasion to Alexandria, and so he was stationed there. But working out with the War Department, they figured they could get him a train from Alexandria or get across the bridge here for Sunday morning and have him back in Alexandria Sunday evening for his next shift of duty. So that was the arrangement. Now, Lincoln did a lot of things after that. Very clearly, there was a great effort on the behalf of Mr. and Mrs. Lincoln to find things to dress up the bridal trousseau. So the New York Times reported on how excellent her trousseau was, described her dress in detail, her accoutrement, and it was all exceptional things which the pastor would not have had on hand. So very clearly that part of the story seems to be true, that the Lincolns responded quickly in 2 days to make this a very successful wedding. Unbeknownst to the two in the couple, 1,000 people showed up to witness their wedding. And we're talking 2 days' notice here, so clearly the president helped to get the word out, and people were expecting to see the president there, which he was. So that set the stage for family relationships, which continued to develop. Gurley, in fact, wrote his first letter of recommendation for a Washington citizen on April 1st, when he recommended that Edward C. Carrington, the general of the D.C. militia, be appointed to the Attorney General for the District of Columbia. That was the first of what I've been able to find is over 30 letters recommending different people for different positions. Now, it was mentioned earlier, Lincoln was under quite a crush to find qualified candidates, qualified Republican, qualified Unionist candidates. Many of the people in D.C., it was unclear where their loyalties were going to lie. He was trying to change over and seize control of the government with the right kind of people. So unlike Wayne Temple, the Lincoln biographer who claims that Gurley was a pest, just like any other office seeker, I think that Lincoln did in fact solicit Gurley's recommendation on character, particularly for chaplaincy positions, but also for others, as in the case of Carrington. The president even asked for Gurley's opinion, and you can see in the letters that Gurley is responding to the president's request for information on people. So I think that if you look at the whole context of all the letters that are on file and available from Gurley to Lincoln, you'll see that there is a very positive context here, and that it should not be demeaned as a hanger-on type relationship. In fact, at the Battle of Second Bull Run, we find that the pastor and the president, after the cabinet meeting held that Sunday morning, when he announced that he would have to swallow his pride and reappoint the discredited General McClellan, he invited the pastor over in the afternoon and they prayed. And the pastor writes, when the tension got so great as to what was happening over in Virginia, the pastor got down on his knees to continue the prayer, and the president joined him in that position. Very clearly there was a very comfortable, very close relationship that is developed. Now here's where I have to talk about the Gurley influence of the old school academics, particularly Charles Hodge. We have noted that Charles Hodge was the preeminent theologian of the era, particularly for the old school, the academic Presbyterians. And several themes come out in Gurley's preaching that are connected directly with Hodge's writings. God governs the universe towards some great end. The doctrine of providence excludes both necessity and chance, which had been an earlier Lincoln belief, substituting for them the intelligent and meditation on the divine will. And in that, Lincoln refers to, for the first time, this higher religious concept that, gee, everybody prays to the same God. He could end this thing quickly if he wanted to, but he's not. The conflict continues. His instruments, me, Jeff Davis, are doing exactly what they can and should do according to the best of their ability. That is almost a quote, the way it's phrased in the meditation from Charles Hodge. So very clearly there is an understanding as to what the old school Presbyterian concept of that deity is and how it's infiltrating Lincoln's thought process. It was in March 1862 in his message to Congress that for the first time in his life, Lincoln used the term "my" in front of God, accepting a personal deity, a personal relationship with God, and hence that responsibility, as Hodge would have defined. His law partner, Herndon, had described just a few years earlier, Lincoln had him take God out of a speech that Herndon had written for him because it implied a person, and no such person ever existed. Very clearly, Lincoln is beginning to open his mind to seek a deeper faith in the midst of this terrible conflict. Elizabeth referred to the casualty rates. This was becoming such an overwhelming conflict. The blood was so incalculable that one author today, Mr. Paladin, suggests that Lincoln turned to biblical concepts for communication simply because regular argument simply was inadequate to describe what was going on in the country. If he needed to explain it, he had to deal with the language of the Bible in prophetic sense. So a few weeks after the funeral of Lincoln's son Willie, who died on February 20, 1862, Gurley tells the story of coming out of the White House one morning. The president had invited him there, And he bumps into one of his congregants, who happened to be Admiral Foote, who was in D.C. recovering from a foot injury. But the Admiral said, Doctor, you're at the White House so early. Were you with the President? Is there a problem? Were you discussing the war? And Gurley says, no, we weren't. We were discussing heaven, the afterlife, and God, which Mr. Lincoln never tires of. And today, Mr. Lincoln did all the talking. Now, the significance of that, once you unpack some of these simple statements that exist, I believe that what Gurley was referring to was a teaching principle, which he had learned at Princeton. Whereas the professor will sit with the student and over a period of time develop a concept and have the student play back what they heard and add their own definition and interpretation of what the concept was until the student, in fact, becomes the professor. And I think that's what Gurley was referring here to. Lincoln, as a quick study, had taken everything that Gurley could present in front of him and now played it back in his own words in a way which obviously was coming from his heart and soul with regard to his role as God's instrument in the Civil War. I'm not going to talk about the second inaugural. That, I think, comes directly from the meditation. That you begin to see how these concepts develop, where Lincoln does not approach this as one side blaming the other. But really, he sees, as God does in Gurley's definition, he sees the end from the beginning. He knows where this thing's going to go, where he wants it to go. He's talking about what happens after this war. And he's seeing during the war the reconciliation process. Fast forward to the assassination. We talked about the deathbed scene. Now afterwards, Gurley is charged with leading the national mourning of the president's death. He gives the funeral sermon in the East Room of the White House. He repeats that sermon at the Capitol building for the public. He's on the train to Springfield for the burial, where he gives the final benediction, not the principal address, but the final benediction. And Gurley, during that time, talks about the relationship, I speak what I know. He goes on to describe Lincoln as having the most Christian-like qualities of any gentleman he's ever known. He makes the case for why history will honor this man and understand all of the virtues that he has brought to this job and the skill of his administration in guiding us to a successful conclusion. He begins the process with this of the mythification of the president and that personality. But he does not say that he's a Christian. This becomes a huge issue with many of the Christian community, the Christian being the dominant political force when you collect all the denominations at that time. There was an opportunity here for him to relieve everybody's mind and say, yes, he was a Christian. Yes, he has acknowledged the Christ as his personal Redeemer and Savior, and that he has become a Christian as we understand it. Listing all these qualities of a Christian gentleman, he can't make that leap to say that he has in fact accepted the religion. We all know the controversy that has developed since then. Everybody wants to claim him as having adopted their faith, their denomination. The skill of the man to keep enough of God in his presentation to bring people together without taking the next step to where he would be taking sides within the Christian God, within the people believing God, to go one side or the other. It's a marvelous stretch, but it made the impression in Gurley. Dr. Gurley, as I've described, was a very conservative, old-school Christian. It was because of the Lincoln example that he realized, maybe I ought to question my conservatism here. Maybe there is a need to liberalize my faith a bit, to be able to include more of my brothers in this vision that the president created for a more unified country. The way that played out, Gurley shortly thereafter was inviting black ministers to the forums of the white church leaders in town. The principal convention in town would have been for the Young Men's Christian Association, which was a very large national organization at the time, very active in cultivating young men to bring them up through activities around the church. At that convention, which was convened in Washington, on this site in the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church, there was a dramatic scene described in the newspapers where there was a vote, an argument to throw out the black minister from Bethel Church over near the Capitol, which has become the Metropolitan AME, to throw him out because we just don't want to set the precedent of having not only a black man in this group, but also he was nominated as an officer. Gurley said, let's pray for a moment on this. And at the end of the prayer, a man got up in the auditorium who claimed to have been a Confederate officer during the war. And he said, I see the point. I'm willing to take this man by the hand and keep him in lead. So Gurley, I believe, had set the stage for this drama to unfold, which set the precedent for uniting, at least for the policy discussions within town, black and white churches in the city of Washington. Gurley took the initiative in fundraising for the suffering South. This church, as people who belong here know, has sent money to a black church south of Richmond that had been burned during the war for their reconstruction. He also led a major fundraising effort to send food and supplies to people in different cities in the South as part of a national coordinated effort. Gurley led that. It was led from this church. The big opportunity that he had on stage was, as his reputation is growing as national prominence, he goes to the General Assembly in 1866. This is a year after the war, a year after the president's burial, and he is presented as the chairman of the Judiciary Committee with a testament from the men of Louisville. And they, in their testament, object to the church taking a position on slavery. They still don't want to talk about it because it's in the Bible, it's acceptable. And they want to take a vote on accept which government they're willing to pledge loyalty to. And at this point, they're thinking state government would be where they'd want their loyalties to lie, more controllable by them. Gurley led the discussion that we're not fighting the war again. This is over. We are now one church, we are one country, and all of these old conflicts are gone. For that, he was excoriated throughout the Southern press. The next year, he is pressed with the idea of defending that decision, which he led as the chief of the judiciary, and how to solve the problem of the reunification of the old school and the new school churches. The old school liberals and the new school the old school conservatives and the new school liberals were trying to find a way. They all agreed that, gee, maybe it is time for us to get together again. The old matters of doctrine are not what they used to be. And Gurley was part of the committee who discussed these issues. They weren't getting anywhere. Everybody got up to go to lunch. He stayed in his seat. The New York Times describes the drama when everybody comes back in the room to find Dr. Gurley still there. They turn to him and they say, Doctor, what's on your mind? And he gets up and he gives this brief, impassioned speech in which he describes the language by which both parties can come together. This appears in the New York Times. Everybody is relieved. Yes, this solves the problem. We can all get together. Everybody leaves the conference saying, okay, we can do this. We can reunite the old school and the new school churches. Unfortunately, his mentor, Dr. Hodge, is the leader of the conservative faction, still has this vision where we're going to reunite with the conservative churches of the South after the war. He publishes in his Biblical Review, Princeton Review and Biblical Repertory is his magazine, an excoriating attack on his old mentee and that position that we can somehow find a way to reunite. Their doctrine is nowhere near what we need it to be. Come back in 1868, and the thing is approved. The Gurley Resolution, which made this possible, is approved. The old school and the new school in the North reunite. Leading newspapers. The initiative is seized by his opponents. First of all, you've got Dr. Hodge, who is writing his Princeton Review. There's this effort to play down the Gurley relationship. And now being dead, he certainly didn't speak. This was the effort to rally around, to minimize his contributions to the country and to his church were complete by this, the negative press of the people that didn't give up on the Civil War. The only places where you'll find positive mentions of Gurley is in the in-depth religious descriptions of the histories that people wrote at the time. Now, given that we are a secular country in recent years, you never find these journals referenced in the footnotes of many of the publications today, and that's why people are more easily likely to overlook Gurley's contributions. Let me stop there and see if there are any questions or comments you'd like to make, and